Our first speaker is actually Shabari Nair, who is the ILO labor migration specialist for South Asia. Shabari was also the ILO's focal point to the negotiations of the GCM, so he brings this entire perspective of being there on the ground during the GCM negotiations. And Shabari has also previously worked with the Swiss Development Cooperation in different roles. So welcome, Shabari. Thank you for being with us today. You will be our first speaker, followed by our second speaker, who is Jean de Kunna. Jean de Kunna is the UN Women Senior Global Advisor on International Migration. She is based in the regional office of the Arab states, but covers the issue of migration more globally. Previously, Jean was also headed the East, South, and Southeast Asia regional office in Bangkok. Thank you, Jean, for being with us today. Our third speaker is Philip Hunter. He is the head of the Labor Migration Unit at IOM in Geneva. His work focuses on ethical recruitment, the private sector, and supply chain engagement. Prior to joining IOM, Philip worked with ILO and Verité, which is a nonprofit that promotes safe migration and the rights of migrant workers in the global economy. Welcome, Philip. Thank you for being with us today. Shalmali Guttal is our fourth speaker. Shalmali is the executive director of Focus on the Global South, actually, which is an NGO that focuses on trade, investment, debt, land, and natural resource governance. And Shalmali has more than 25 years experience in those areas. And her focus has been on community rights to resources, women's rights, and democratization of governance. Welcome, Shalmali. Great to have you with us today. Patrick Tehran is our fifth speaker. Patrick is the president of GMPA, which is the Global Migration Policy Associates. He is an expert network conducting research, policy development, advisory services, and training worldwide. Patrick also previously worked with the ILO as the senior migration specialist in Geneva. He's also a visiting professor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and a senior fellow at the Global Migration Center. Thanks for being with us today, Patrick. Welcome. And our last speaker is Myrtle Whitbo. Myrtle is actually the president of the International Domestic Workers Federation. Myrtle was a domestic worker herself and has worked to organize domestic workers for the past 47 years in South Africa. She has been involved in a number of campaigns, including the Domestic Workers Convention campaign. And her passion has always been about serving the workers. Welcome, Myrtle. We're very happy to have you with us today. In terms of the mechanics of the webinar, and before we start, we do have a packed webinar with 6 speakers, so we'll try to be punctual as much as possible. Each speaker will have around 8 minutes, not more, hopefully, to cover the initial intervention. But we will come back to our speakers with follow-up questions during the webinar and with concluding remarks towards the end of the webinar. We will also try to take a few comments from the floor, as much as time allows, because we are a little bit pressed for time, but we will try to take a few comments from the floor. If you would like to say something during the webinar, please let me know, and we will try to accommodate as much as possible. This is in terms of the mechanics of the webinar, but I guess it's time to get started on our discussion and try to delve as much as possible into the subject. And Shabari, if I can start with you, you know, discussions about labor migration, Shabari, are not new, right? They have been going on for a very long time, and discussions about decent work are also not new and predate the GCM in many ways. Shabari, you were on the ground in New York during the negotiations of the Global Compact, so you really got a sense of what were the biggest issues. And obviously, as ILO, decent work is something that is very important to you. Can you tell us what in your opinion, you see as the biggest critical discussions in relation to decent work and labor migration today?
Thanks so much, Rula. Rula, maybe just a thumbs up if you can hear me fine. You can hear me fine? Great, okay. Fantastic. Thanks, Patrick, for the thumbs up as well. No, it's such a pleasure to be here. I think even more of a pleasure because I think Rula to CCRM, MFA, GFRDT, and the Civil Society Action Committee, this is the first time you actually have 3 UN representatives on one webinar panel. So congratulations to you for getting the UN together in a way. I think this is very special as well. You know, great to see Jean and Phil here, and I'm sure they will give you, Jean specifically on the women migration aspect will come in. Phil, IOM has a very important role to play in the conversations that we've been having jointly will come in. Patrick, as a former ILO representative, also will be speaking on certain labor standards. I'm sure Patrick was the flag bearer for multilateral framework on migration. And Shalmali, pleasure to meet you. But Myrtle, the reason I wanted to say it along these lines is because I want to give a special shout out to Myrtle. And thanks for that introduction, Rula, because by identifying Myrtle as someone who was been a domestic worker, who has understood the situation on the ground, really brings in the migrant voice into this conversation as well. And I think that's important to recognize. Now, thanks, Rula. You know, just going back and reflecting on the conversations that we will be having over the next couple of hours, going back to where I came from 2 years back, where some of us came from in the context of the GCM negotiations. I remember at the time, there was a whole debate amongst certain people in the corridors on whether this should be the global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, or whether this should be the global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration for low-skilled migrant workers. That was the conversation that a lot of us were having. It was not necessarily, you know, how many of us sitting here today worry about having to be recruited through a recruitment agency, have to go through a recruitment agency to be recruited for employment in another country. I mean, for a lot of us, it's really a privilege being able to just fill up a form, submit an application for a vacancy notice, and accordingly, you know, decide if we want to take up the job or not. I remember at the time during the negotiations and when the final text was endorsed on the 13th of July, 2018, the Filipino ambassador to Geneva, who was also leading the negotiations, the Filipino delegation to New York for the negotiations, said that very clearly labor migration as a conversation in the GCM was the beating heart of the Global Compact for Migration. He said, this is what pulsates across the document in the context of what is priority as for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And therefore, labor migration being this, if Gervais said keystone in the last objective discussion on Objective 5, I call this the cornerstone of any aspect of a conversation on the GCM starts with fair recruitment. You know, Rula, I appreciate you starting by saying also the fact that labor migration has not started in the recent few years. You know, for me, my story on labor migration goes back to 1975 when my father migrated to Qatar. And those days, you know, his stories from those days go back to how he was recruited or he was given a job offer by the employer in Qatar when he went for the interview in Bombay, simply because he reached the interview on time. He knocked the door for an 8 a.m. interview at 7:58. The recruiter opened the door, asked Gopi, that's my father's name. He said, yes, very good, you have the job. This is how in 1975 recruitments happened. A number of Gulf countries, a number of countries in the Middle East had just gotten their independence. And a lot of people who were recruited during this time were in demand. They were needed, whether they were to build those buildings and engage in construction, or whether it was in skills like my father went, which was as a stenographer, a typist, somebody who knew how to read and write in shorthand. That was the kind of low and semi-skilled perspectives which were in demand. You know, majority of those people, if you go back to those days, they will tell you that they had a very positive migration experience. Those days, in fact, 1 Qatari riyal gave 2 Indian rupees in 1975. Today, 1 Qatari riyal gives about 20 Indian rupees, 10 times that original amount. So in 45 years, what we have seen is the tables have been overturned. The tables have been overturned from what was previously a demand-driven system, a demand for workers, to now a supply-driven recruitment system. So today it's almost like an auction of workers, for the need to put it in a better way. I may not be able to do that, but the idea of saying that workers today are being auctioned off to the lowest bidder, and for which the workers themselves have to pay. If it is a good migration experience, then it's a great job. Workers have got a job, they have appreciated the experience, everything has worked for them. On the other hand, if it is a bad migration experience, then migrant workers have paid into servitude. Unfortunately, that is the situation that we also find a lot of the workers in, as far as the migration recruitment corridors are concerned between the different regions. Now, it's important to recognize that the recruitment system has not been developing in a vacuum. The recruitment industry now, which is so important and so key a player, has been developing or has developed because initially there was a big demand from countries of destinations. And the only way that people, these semi and low skilled category of workers, the only way they could migrate was by being able to identify themselves through a middleman, or in this case, a recruitment agent. Sorry for not being gender neutral there, because most recruitment agents are men. But along those lines, if we look at it, then what we have seen is, while the demand has grown along these last many number of decades of migration, the supply has exponentially grown higher than the demand. Therefore, it is much more easier now for employers to demand what they think is necessary for them, and the recruiters now having to try and meet those demands, therefore leading into a whole range of other complications in terms of the migration corridor. Objective 6 is also very specific in that Objective 6 of the GCM is the only objective which in the title mentions the term decent work. It is the only objective which there are 14 references to decent work in the GCM. And out of those 14 references, close to half of them come in Objective 6. So it's very clear that decent work is such an important facet while considering fair recruitment. Now, what is decent work? Now, the moment we say decent work, the ILO has defined the decent work agenda. And this has happened during the time when Patrick and some of the others were leading the work on labor migration within the ILO. And the decent work agenda comprises of 4 pillars. Those pillars are, with regards to productive employment or employment creation, social protection, social dialogue, and labor standards, and ensuring and strengthening labor standards. If we look at productive employment, that links into skills, investment in jobs, the future of work that we have been talking about, that was adopted by the ILO in 2019 as part of its centenary declaration. Social protection is about housing, it's about healthcare, it's about end service benefits. I'm thinking about all those issues which have been impacted as a result of COVID. How can we have 8 people living in an 8x8 room if they have to maintain social distance and be able to get away from COVID as such? So social protection, such an important element of the decent work angle. Social dialogue. Social dialogue is where it brings trade unions, employers, and the government together. In most countries of destination that we are speaking about, particularly for South Asian migrant workers, there are no trade unions necessarily in those conversations. And international labor standards. Of course, we have the UN Convention on Migrant Workers, the 1991 Convention, and prior to that, the ILO migration conventions themselves. The ILO has set in very strong standards and guidelines on fair recruitment. There is a whole conversation on recruitment fees, related costs. What do they mean? We will hear this from Phil. I'm sure Phil will talk about IRIS, the International Recruitment Integrity Standards, which Phil will speak about, but that IRIS 2 is based on the fair recruitment guidelines. But the reason why I mention these four elements is because decent work is very clearly one that can be achieved only if there is fair recruitment. You know, take for example, one of the things that we always say, and Rula and all of you will recognize the fact that the GCM, which came in 2018, is rooted in the SDGs, you know, very clearly. However, in the SDGs, we have, which is basically my version of MDG on steroids. You have from the MDG of 8 goals to the SDG of 17 goals and 169 targets and 250 odd global indicators. Let's look at one specific indicator, 10.7.1 of the SDGs. Goal number 10, which focuses on reducing inequalities between and amongst countries. Target number 7 of that particular goal, which specifically speaks about facilitating safe, orderly, and regular migration. In fact, so many people during the negotiations used to say that the GCM is the blueprint for how we need to implement 10.7. If that's the case, indicator 10.7.1 is specifically to measure recruitment costs. However, the measurement of recruitment costs in itself was such a difficult, we are facing so many difficulties in recruitment costs. You know, there are, I've heard from good friends in the recruitment industry within in India, for instance, who say that only 20 to 30% of recruitment fees come from the employers, while about 70 to 80% are paid by the migrant workers. In Bangladesh, it's about 17 months of the migrant workers' wages that need to be paid to recoup their recruitment costs. 17 months, and for a female migrant worker, it's about 5 months of the recruitment costs. This is the kind of a situation that we are in. How exactly are we now going to achieve that SDG indicator when that indicator will most probably be dropped, because out of the 193 UN member states, at least half the membership of the United Nations should agree to measure those corresponding indicators. So it is possible that that indicator is dropped. So therefore, even a political will on recruitment related issues is something that we need to help generate. I'll conclude with some final remarks, and we'll hear from the others as well. It's this: very clearly, recruitment cuts across the board. Objective 6 is where it stays, but recruitment cannot be looked at without understanding the data. Objective 1, recruitment links into decent work at home because recruitment starts at home. Recruitment is about providing timely information. Objective 3, recruitment is about ensuring that identity documents are not taken away. Therefore, it is also about objective 4, recruitment is about regular pathways. And I can go on. Recruitment really cuts across the board, even up to objective 23, which is on international cooperation. And that's where fair recruitment comes in. So let's be clear. We need to first focus on decent work at home. Because in some countries in South Asia, let's not forget that there is a big competition between countries to send migrant workers overseas for work because they're not able to create jobs at home. Very clearly, this is one of the biggest issues that we need to be able to address to ensure fair recruitment. In a lot of countries in South Asia, over 90% of workers are in the informal economy. How do we ensure fair recruitment for such people? So the way to look at it is by ensuring first fair recruitment at home. Only then, for the domestic market, only then can migrant workers be fairly recruited. I'll stop there. Thanks a lot, Rula.
Thank you. Thanks, Shabari. And you know, a lot of important points, and also bringing up the complexities in the recruitment problem, in the recruitment process, and some of the problems that do occur along the ways.